The tape was still turning. It was somewhere past 2 in the morning inside Sunset Sound Recorders on Cahuenga Boulevard in Hollywood, and the studio had been empty for nearly an hour. The engineers had gone home. The band had gone home. Producer Paul Rothchild had gathered his notes in his jacket and said goodnight with the particular satisfaction of someone who has just witnessed something genuinely extraordinary and knows it. The session had been that good, the vocal had been that complete. There was nothing left to do except let the tape run out and call it one of the best days of recording anyone in that room had ever been part of. But Janis Joplin had not gone home. She sat alone in the control room, in the chair that Rothschild had been sitting in all evening, the one positioned directly in front of the main monitors. The overhead lights were off, the only light came from the equipment, the soft amber glow of the mixing board, the needle movements of the VU meters running in the dark, the faint illumination of the tape machine still turning in the other room. She had a drink beside her that she wasn't touching. She had a cigarette burning down in the ashtray that she had lit and then forgotten. And she was listening to what they had recorded that evening, not checking it, not evaluating it professionally. She was simply listening, the way a person listens to something that has cost them everything they had. The song playing through those monitors was Me and Bobby McGee, and what was coming through the speakers, what Janis Joplin was hearing in the dark alone, in a room that still smelled of cigarette smoke and the particular electric warmth of a long recording session, was the most complete thing she had ever made. She knew it while she was singing it. She knew it more completely now, hearing it played back, hearing what the microphone had caught, and what the tape had held, and what was going to outlast every room she had ever stood in. And she was crying. Not the way she cried on stage, which was performative in the truest sense, emotion made visible so that other people could feel it alongside her. This was different. This was the crying that happens when something has been completed and the completion reveals, with a clarity that ordinary days protect you from, exactly how much was spent in the making of it. This was the crying of someone who has given something away so completely that they can hear, in the finished thing, the precise shape of the absence it has left behind. Nobody saw it, nobody was there to see it. The control room was dark, and the building was nearly empty, and the city outside was doing what cities do at 2 in the morning, continuing without reference to any individual feeling, indifferent and enormous and ongoing. But the tape was still turning, and in the years since that night, the question of what Janis Joplin was actually hearing in those hours has become something more than biographical curiosity. It has become a way of understanding the whole arc of her life, why the voice had the power it had, what it cost to produce that power, and what it means that the most extraordinary thing she ever recorded was made in the last week she was alive. This is the story of that night, and everything that led to it. To understand what happened in that control room, you have to understand what the preceding year had cost her, because 1970 was not the year that broke Janis Joplin. It was the year she put herself back together, carefully, deliberately, with a seriousness of purpose that the people around her found both impressive and slightly alarming. The way genuine transformation always alarms people who have built their relationship with someone around a particular version of them. The year before had been harder. The Kozmic Blues Band era, the period after she left Big Brother and the holding company, the period when she was supposed to be launching the solo career that her Monterey reputation had made inevitable, had not gone the way anyone had planned. The album had sold, the shows had sold out. From the outside, it looked like exactly what success was supposed to look like. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The Kozmic Blues Band was a professional outfit, skilled and tight and capable of providing the musical foundation a lead vocalist needed. What it was not capable of providing was the specific kind of chemistry that Big Brother had given her, the sense that the music was being made rather than performed, that everyone on stage was taking a risk together rather than executing a plan. Janis had spent 3 years with Big Brother learning to trust that the floor would hold when she jumped. With the Kozmic Blues Band, she was jumping and landing every time professionally and reliably, but the landing felt different, more controlled, less alive. She said this in private to the few people she was honest with, in terms that she was careful never to let reach the press. She had left Big Brother publicly and with some acrimony, saying that the more serious direction felt less real, was not a narrative she could afford in 1969, so she kept it private and performed professionally, and went back to the hotel room afterward and sat with the particular silence of someone who has traded one form of belonging for another and isn't sure yet whether the trade was worth it. There were other things in that period that she kept private. The emotional turbulence that had always been her baseline condition was running without adequate outlet. She was drinking more than she should have. She was making decisions about people and about evenings that she would not have made if she had been sleeping properly, eating properly, giving herself the kind of basic physical maintenance that touring musicians learn to deprioritize and eventually forget how to do it all. And underneath all of it, constant and unresolved, was the thing that Port Arthur had installed in her, the specific durable conviction that the love and attention she received was contingent on the performance, that the rooms filled because of what she could do rather than because of who she was, and that if the performance ever fell short, the rooms would empty just as quickly as they had filled. By late 1969, Janis was exhausted in ways that showed not in the performances. Those remained extraordinary because the performances were the one place where the exhaustion transformed into something else, where everything she was carrying became fuel rather than weight. But in the spaces between, the exhaustion was visible to the people who knew her well enough to look for it. Then, in the spring of 1970, something shifted. The shift did not come from a single decision. It came from the accumulation of several things happening in close proximity. She left the Kozmic Blues Band and began assembling a new group, the Full Tilt Boogie Band, built differently, chosen differently, put together with a specific intention she had not brought to the previous band. She was looking not just for musicians, but for a particular quality of musical conversation. People who would push back, who would bring something of their own, who would create the conditions for genuine making rather than skilled executing. She found them, the Full Tilt Boogie Band, with John Till on lead guitar, Brad Campbell on bass, Ken Pearson on organ, Richard Bell on piano, and Clark Pearson on drums, was from the first rehearsal a different kind of entity. The chemistry was not identical to Big Brother, nothing could be, but it had the quality that Big Brother had had. It felt like music being discovered rather than delivered. She also made some decisions about her personal life that her closest friends characterized carefully as stabilizing. She was clearer about what she needed. She was more direct about asking for it. She was sleeping more. She was drinking less, not with the militant abstinence of someone in crisis management, but with the quiet moderation of someone who has decided that the thing the drinking was supposed to fix is not actually fixed by drinking. Paul Rothschild, brought in to produce the album that would become Pearl, met Janis for the first time in the summer of 1970. He later described her walking into the first production meeting with a clarity of artistic intention he had not expected based on her reputation. She knew what she wanted the record to be. She had opinions about arrangement and production that were grounded in genuine musical intelligence. She was, he said, the most prepared artist he had worked with in years. But he also noticed something else. The clarity of intention was held together by something that looked like effort. Not strain, but the particular focus of someone who is choosing every day to be the version of themselves they know they are capable of being. It was an active thing. You could see it operating. He did not know in those first weeks of production what it was costing her. He would understand better later. The sessions for Pearl began at Sunset Sound in September 1970. The studio on Cahuenga Boulevard was a particular kind of place. Warm acoustics, a certain analog intimacy to the rooms, a history of recordings that had given it a specific atmosphere. The kind of studio where the equipment had been used enough to have a sound of its own. Janis arrived at the first session with a specific request for Rothschild. She wanted the vocal performances to be as live as possible. She did not want to overproduce. She did not want to fix things in post that could be fixed in performance. She wanted the record to sound like something that happened rather than something that was constructed. What unfolded over the following weeks was, by every account, a recording process unlike others they had experienced. Not because it was chaotic, it was the opposite. She arrived prepared. She had done her homework on the songs. She was, in the language of studio musicians, easy to work with. She was also capable of vocal performances that made the engineers forget to do their jobs. Nick Gravenites, who had known Janis since the early San Francisco days, visited the sessions and later described watching her record a vocal take with the quality of someone seeing something they had been watching develop for years arrive at its final form. He said the voice had changed, not in character, but in completeness. It had always been powerful. Now it was also precise. She had learned, over the decades since those first Texas coffee shop stages, not how to contain the voice, but how to aim it. The difference between those two things is the difference between a fire and a torch. And then, on October 1st, 1970, Chris Christopherson's song came up in the session order. Me and Bobby McGee had been written in 1969, recorded by various artists in the year since. Janis had heard multiple versions, had been sitting with her own ideas for months, turning the song over in the way she turned all songs, not as a musician preparing a performance, but as a person deciding how much of themselves to bring to a particular set of words. She brought everything. The recording took several hours, not because the performance was elusive. It was clear from early takes that she had this song in a very specific place, but because Janis kept finding new things inside it. The song was about freedom and loss, about roads and the people you meet on them, and the fact that what feels like liberation when you're moving feels like loneliness when you stop. She had lived this, not as metaphor, as biography. The hitchhiked miles from Texas to California, the cheap rooms in San Francisco, the years of moving towards something without being certain what it was. She had been singing about these things her entire career, and now here was a song that had been written in language that fit the experience exactly. Rulda's child watched her work through the takes from behind the glass. He later described the session as the most complete piece of vocal production he had ever witnessed, each version reaching further into the material than the last, until the final take had a quality simply beyond what the earlier takes had been. John Tail, playing behind her, said afterward that there was a moment in the final take where he understood what the song had actually been about all along, not intellectually but physically through the performance happening a few feet away from him. That is what genuinely great vocal performance does. It doesn't just interpret the material, it reveals it. When the final take ended, the studio was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that follows something complete. Then Rothschild's voice came through the talkback speaker. That's it. That's the one. Janis pulled off her headphones and stood in the live room for a moment, not moving. Then she nodded once and walked into the control room. They listened to the take together, Janis, Rothschild, the engineer, a few members of the band. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them is hearing the same thing and the thing is extraordinary. After it finished, Janis lit a cigarette and moved into the conversation about tomorrow's session with a practicality that struck people as slightly surprising given what they had just witnessed. She had made something remarkable and she was already moving past it. But she hadn't finished with it yet. Not quite. Paul Rothschild left the studio that night around 1:30 in the morning. As he gathered his things to leave, he glanced through the glass of the control room and saw Janis still sitting in his chair at the mixing board. He assumed she was winding down, would be leaving in a few minutes. He said goodnight. She nodded. He drove home. What happened in the studio after he left is not documented the way the recording sessions were documented. What is known comes from Janis herself, from things she said in the days that followed to the people she was close to, fragments of conversation that those people later recalled with the careful attention of individuals, reconstructing something that has become important in retrospect. She told at least two people that she had stayed in the studio after everyone left, that she had played back the Me and Bobby McGee take several times, alone, in the dark, that she had cried while listening to it, not once but repeatedly, the crying coming back each time the song came around to certain lines, certain moments in her own performance where something true had been caught on tape in a way she hadn't expected. She did not explain exactly why she was crying. What she said in both conversations amounted to the same thing. She said she heard in the performance everything she had been trying to say for years, not just in that song, in all of them. She said it sounded like the truth. And she said, this is the detail that the people she told remembered most clearly, that hearing the truth of it made her understand something about the years it had taken to get there, that the crying was not grief exactly, it was the emotion of a person who has finally done the thing they were trying to do, and in the doing of it, understands for the first time the full weight of what the trying cost. Jean Till was one of the people she talked to in those days. He said she seemed different after that night, quieter in a way that was different from her usual quietness, more settled. He said she seemed like someone who had arrived somewhere, and was taking a moment to look around at what the arrival actually meant. 3 days after the Me and Bobby McGee session, on October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin was scheduled to return to Sunset Sound to record the vocal for a track called Buried Alive in the Blues, an instrumental waiting for her voice to complete it. She never arrived. She died that evening at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood. She was 27 years old. The tape of Me and Bobby McGee was still in the machine at Sunset Sound. Pearl was completed without her and released in January 1971. It went to number one. Me and Bobby McGee reached number one as a single, the biggest chart success of her career, and the one she never saw. The last track on the album, Buried Alive in the Blues, runs its full length without a vocal, the band playing through the space where her voice was supposed to be. The effect is devastating. Music built around an absence, a shape defined by what is missing. In the years since, the recording of Me and Bobby McGee has been analyzed and ranked and placed in historical context. The analysis is accurate and the rankings are deserved, but they miss the thing that Janis Joplin was hearing in that control room at 2 in the morning, alone, in the dark. She was not hearing a great performance. She was hearing the full distance she had traveled to give it. She was hearing the girl in Port Arthur who had been told she was ugly and wrong and too much, and she was hearing what that girl's voice had become, not in spite of the telling, but in part because of it. She was hearing the Port Arthur Gymnasium and the San Francisco fog and the Monterey crowd, and the Kozmic Blues Band loneliness and the full Tilt Boogie Band clarity, all of it compressed into a few minutes of tape, all of it audible if you knew what to listen for. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. She had lived that line before she sang it, and in the playback, alone in the studio, she could hear the living and the singing simultaneously and understand how they had produced each other. That is what she was crying about. Not sadness, not the particular darkness that had followed her since Texas. She was crying about completion, about the specific, irreversible quality of having made something that was exactly what it needed to be. Paul Rothschild returned several times in interviews after her death to the image of her sitting in his chair in the dark, listening. He said he had not understood at the time what he was seeing. He understood it afterward. The image stayed with him for the rest of his life. The voice that had been building toward that moment for 27 years, finally alone with the evidence of its own completion. There is a particular kind of artist who gives everything genuinely and completely every time they perform, people for whom the alternative to total commitment is not partial commitment but nothing at all. For these artists, the art is not something they do. It is what they are, translated into a form that other people can receive. The translation costs the original. Every performance is a giving away that cannot be taken back. Janis Joplin was this kind of artist, the voice that made rooms change temperature. That voice was not separate from the person it came from. It was the person translated. Everything she had experienced and survived and carried and refused to put down, made audible. And in the studio on Cahuenga Boulevard at 2 in the morning, 3 days before she died, she sat alone with the tape turning and heard the translation complete. Heard what her life sounded like when it was allowed to be exactly what it was, not what Port Arthur had wanted, not what the industry had tried to shape, what it actually was. Raw, powerful, earned, real. And she cried, not because it was sad, because it was true. The tape was still turning. The monitors were still warm, and the greatest voice of her generation sat alone with the evidence of itself and understood finally and completely what it had always been trying to say. I was here. I was real. I felt everything and I didn't look away. And I gave it all away every night to rooms full of strangers because that was the only thing I knew how to do that was true. The tape caught it. The tape held it. And 50 years later, it is still holding